Well, after a few comfortable chapters in 1 Samuel, here we are back into a load of challenging events. And you can imagine, or try and picture in some senses, a bit of a film crew doing a documentary. And to begin with, in 1 Samuel, they're looking more broadly across the nation. There's a bit of an interest in Samuel and what is taking place with him, but there's an awareness of the broader scale of what is going on, what the spirit of the people is like, how things are being approached, and that picture is being painted before everybody. And then you have a cameraman that focuses on Saul, and they start seeing more about Saul's life, and then we add an extra one, and it brings in David. And slowly what's going to end up happening is the nation as a whole, and the scope and the vision of that is going to fade a little bit, and the focus comes down to looking at these two characters, Saul and David. And what we end up seeing is a load of issues. That is part of the wonderful character of the Bible, isn't it? That it isn't just written by the victors. Okay, we know that the Lord is the victory of all, but it doesn't just write out and show us just the highlights, just the best bits. It covers everything, the struggles, the concerns, the ups, the downs, the issues, even the pitfalls and the failings of God's people. And why? Well, it's to remind us that this is the way that life has always been for God's people. God never says to us, does he? And if you think he says that, please find the verse and come and show us. Become a Christian, have an easy life. He doesn't say that. There is always struggles and turmoil and challenges, and we need to be aware of that. We can't ignore it. Thing is, though, when they crop up, we often find ourselves having a bit of, maybe a bit of frustration, as we were thinking a little bit earlier with the kids, bit of a panic and a bit of a worry. What is going on? And maybe as we read through this passage a little earlier, you were thinking, how are we going to deal with this? What can we learn? Well, the simple thing we're going to come back to again in this passage is God is always working. And there are three things and three areas we're going to consider to see and show how God was working even in these events here from chapter 18 into chapter 19. God is never passive. There are times where it looks like things are just going to get away from us. Certainly the more you look at David, the more it looks like that, doesn't it? As he flees from Saul time and time again. And why is that? Well, often when God works, it is done quietly, isn't it? God doesn't always do everything with tremendous fanfare and an angel coming and pronouncing it from heaven as to what God is going to do, and a voice saying, this is how you're going to live or how you're going to act. We'd love that. But God often works quietly. And what we need to do as God's people is to cultivate that spiritual eyes so that we can see how God is working, or at least catch a glimpse of it. Because as we thought about in the studies in Job on Wednesday evenings, Ian's mentioned it several times. One of the things we want when everything starts going wrong is just a sense that God is with us. And I think we can see elements of how we can be aware of that and try to spot it within our lives in the example that we see here before us with David and Saul. And so first heading for this morning is God's provision. Ignore that beginning of, that shouldn't be there. But first heading there is God's provision. God's provision. If you spend any time watching team sports, you will know particularly that there are a whole array and range of tactics that can be played. And you watch, I watched a little bit of the FA Cup yesterday afternoon, and before some of the players came on as substitutes, there's a coach sat down beside them, talking to them furiously, and in my head the dialogue goes something like this: you see the ball, you kick it, right? It should be something like that. But I know it's not. It's way more complicated than that. It's and they talk about you need to move here, and when you do that, that'll suck this player in. You'll create some space for this guy, and they're all thinking about tactics, ways to overcome an enemy. There's planning, there's thought, there's precision about the way that they go about it. And obviously, the best teams execute their tactics well. They succeed and they win. Well, Saul here, as we've read, has multiple tactics. Saul is now intent on bringing David down. Now, we have to get this clear. This is a bizarre situation. You have a king who has a soldier who is remarkably capable, who has the favour of the men, who has the favour of his son, who seems to get victory after victory after victory, and the king says, we've got to kill him. Everything about this should just cry out, this is wrong. And what we find is at every single turn, God not only has a counter move for Saul, but thwarts him, absolutely demolishes every single plan that Saul puts in place. Let's just catalogue a couple of them. Right? Chapter 18, verse 19. Saul is going to give his first daughter Merab in marriage to David. 18 verse 19. So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. You go, well, okay, what's that about? The king changed his mind. His daughter marries someone else. That's probably a bit helpful for a political treaty. Sorry, his daughter was supposed to marry David. This is an absolute slap in David's face. This is an attempt to deride David and belittle him and demean him. He attacks him from the outset. Then we have verse 21, where he realises that his other daughter, Michal, actually rather likes David, and he says, I will give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. He goes, well, I've got a daughter. Actually, what's tragic is here, he has a really low view of his daughter, doesn't he? He thinks, yeah, she's a bit of a horrible piece of work. She can marry David. She'll cause him all kinds of issues. He obviously seems to know that she was an idolater. Perhaps that's part of his thinking in there as well. But he's going, I'm going to give him something. What gift can I give to this guy to hinder him? I'll give him my daughter. It's not exactly respectful in any sense, is it? But it continues on, because in verse 25, when he says, look, here's what you're going to need to do to prove to me you can marry my daughter. I know you can't pay it. Verse 25, Saul says, say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies. Saul's plan was for David to fall by the hands of the Philistines. Saul says, in case you marry my daughter doesn't work, what I'm going to do is try and preempt it and try and kill you before you even get down to the altar. And we have in chapter 19, verse 1, Saul tells his son Jonathan and the attendants to kill David. And it just goes on. He tries to pin him to the wall. He sends soldiers to David's house. He sends guards to go and capture David after he's fled. There are 7 different ways here in which Saul seeks to bring down David. Let me just go at this point. Why doesn't God step in and do something? Why doesn't God just say, Saul, that's enough? Why don't we read that at the end of chapter 19? That is enough, Saul. You are going to be removed. He doesn't. God allows Saul to stay there. Saul is going to be a long-term issue for David. These little things that take place here are going to be minor in the way of and the scale of where things are going. And in that we need to remember this, first, one of the first things to pick up, is that God doesn't always remove the cause of our problems. But he does provide us with the help, with the sustaining, with the protection, and everything that we need as we go through them. We might wish for God to come along and take a problem and remove it from us. It'd be much easier for David, wouldn't it? It'd be much easier for us at times. But that's not the way that God always works. Why? Well, can you imagine how we would think about God if every time a problem came up, God removed the whole thing? At times we might struggle to and fall into the trap as Christians of thinking that God is like a genie in a bottle. You show him a bit of love, bit of care, bit of interest, and God works for us. If God just removes every problem, the root and all, every time it cropped up, we would just feel, wouldn't we, a degree of, we wouldn't particularly be grateful to God necessarily, actually. We'd start thinking that we deserve things more. We become insufferable to the world round about us. In fact, if God started having to remove the cause of problems, we'd end up saying, well, where will God have to stop? Because in order for God to remove the problems and the threats and the dangers that we face and experience, well, really, we're asking that God is going to end up having to judge and cleanse the world before even Jesus returns. That's not something he says he's going to do. But what we do find is that at every single point, God watches over, turns and uses things against Saul. There is an irony, isn't there, in this passage? It's almost comical, right? How Saul puts something in place, he hopes it'll go wrong, it not only doesn't go wrong, but it ends up being a blessing for David. I mean, take for example his marriage to Michal. And he thinks, oh yeah, she'll trip him up. And instead, what does she do? She helps David to escape. She protects David. She becomes a care for him. Now, Saul tells Jonathan and all his attendants in chapter 19, verse 1, let's go kill David. What does Jonathan do? He goes and talks to Saul and says, actually, he's a good guy. I'm going to talk you out of this. He's talked around and worked around at every single point. Saul, even when he sends his servants to go and capture David, not only when he's there with Samuel, God then intervenes in an incredible way and causes Saul's servants who are there to capture David to prophesy. Now, to have this sign that God was present and that his spirit was working and active. Everything just goes to pieces. There are people, aren't there, in Romans chapter 1, verse 30, people who are opposed to God, and Paul describes them there, those who are wicked, as inventors of evil. That's what Saul is doing here, isn't he? He's inventing all kinds of ways to get at David, all kinds of ways to be an issue or to be a problem. And what we find is God is more inventive still. There isn't anything that is going to overcome God's plans. Why? Because God is going to make David king. This is the Lord's anointed one, and that God is going to protect him time and time again. And that's what David's life is a picture of for us. A reminder of the power of God to sustain, provide, care for, and meet our needs at every single point. Might not always feel like it. I mean, how was David going to be feeling as he went through these experiences? It's going to be a challenge. But isn't that also what we see time and time again throughout Scripture? This continual pointing of, you can trust in God. He will provide. And what is each little rescue? Well, in some senses, it's a mini salvation, isn't it? Every time God works to protect, every time God orchestrates things, even the ordinary mundane things. I mean, we're not even told in this passage much of God actually intervening. But we know that God orders everything. But each mini salvation, each mini episode where things have been orchestrated in a way to protect and to preserve, they just point us towards that greater work, that greater salvation that God has done. Because if he does and cares for all these little mini ways, it just reiterates and reminds us again, he is more than able to save us fully and finally and eternally. Doesn't matter what our circumstances or challenges might be. God might not remove us from the whole problem, but he will be with us through them, there at guiding and helping throughout. And secondly, we have God's judgment. God's judgment. The loss of something is often considered a punishment, isn't it? You want to punish a child, you take away a toy for a little while. You need to punish someone in our society, we might take away their freedom for a little while. But we view it in other ways too, don't we? We can be inclined to say, well, I've lost health. I've lost a loved one. This is a punishment. This is a judgment of God coming upon me. And sometimes we take it even to the extent, and too far, as God's people, of saying that actually we will be the absence of God is the ultimate judgment. And that's not the case, is it? We're told in Psalm 139 that we can't ever flee from God's presence. Nobody can escape from him. Instead, the ultimate judgment that God can ever give is actually the withholding of his love, and instead the pouring out of his wrath. That is what Jesus experienced, wasn't it, on the cross? Referencing Isaiah 51, Jesus, when he's in the upper room with the disciples, says he's going to drink the cup. And when he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, he talks about the cup being taken from him. This is the cup of God's wrath. He says, I don't want to experience your wrath. That is the greatest judgment or punishment someone could face. God's wrath, his anger. And we have to remember how God will always act. Because yes, we might say God will act to care for his people, and he does, and he will. But we have to remember the core reason why God moves at any time is that he's acting for his glory. Even, at times, that might mean that we get a little bit caught up and hurt in it. What does that do with Saul? Well, remember who Saul is. Saul is under the judgment of God. Just flick back a page or two to 1 Samuel 16. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 14. Saul is under the judgment of God. Okay? It says here, now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord was sent to torment him. Saul, God has removed that sense of his nearness and his blessing to be with Saul. In fact, when you go back to chapter 18, in verse 12, we read there, in chapter 18, verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. Now, is that meaning that God had nothing to do with Saul? Well, no, it doesn't, because what we read in chapter 19, verse 9, again, God is still dealing with Saul here, but we read in chapter 19, verse 9, an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul. What God is doing is he's removed that sense of his spirit of blessing and of peace and of love and favour, and instead God is giving a sense of his wrath and judgment upon Saul. And Saul, in the immediate response to the evil spirit coming upon him, takes his spear and tries to throw it at David and pin him to the wall. We get a bit squeamish here when we start talking about God sending evil spirits, and rightly so, because it's an uncomfortable passage. We need to think of it probably in these terms. Now, Saul had spent, hadn't he, a number of years showing that he opposed God and his rule and his reign. He demonstrated that by the way that he'd carried out sacrifices when he shouldn't have done. He'd done that in the way that he'd approached things to do with Samuel, in the laziness in which he'd led and governed the kingdom. His heart was actually being hardened towards God. And now that he's turned away from God, what does God do? God effectively hardens Saul's heart. Where have we heard that before? Well, it's with the Pharaoh in Egypt, isn't it? Remember the Pharaoh when Moses came before him and said, "Let my people go." To begin with the first few plagues, we're told that Pharaoh hardened his heart against it. And then it changes. And we're told that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. There is a time when God not only withdraws from someone his sense of presence and blessing, but he then affirms them and pushes them and allows them to go deeper into the way they're seeking to go. Just turn with me briefly to Romans chapter 1, because Paul says exactly this thing. In Romans chapter 1, read from verse 21, Romans chapter 1, verse 21. Paul, talking about people who've already rejected God, he says, For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts. Paul says this is how they work. When you reject God, when you go against him, when you turn away from him, when you exchange his glory for your glory or for the glory of something else, God will give you over to it. He'll allow you to carry on, to persevere in it. And that is what's happening with Saul. It is why Saul is going after David time and time again. It is why God caused Saul to try and pin David to the wall. Why? Because what does David symbolize? He symbolizes the presence, blessing, glory, and enjoyment of God. He's the Lord's anointed. He is there, and by his every action, he says, I stand for God. I'm here for God's glory. And Saul, he cannot cope with it any longer. He cannot abide the reminder and the remembrance of who God is and what God can do and what God can be like. And because he hates God, he has to hate David too. He has to drive David away. And in fact, actually, David being driven away from Saul actually just further deepens Saul's judgment, doesn't it? Because Saul, remember, why was David in the palace in the first place? Why was he even brought there? Well, it was to come and play the harp or the lyre whenever Saul was in a bad mood, to calm him down. Just everything about David was to speak of God's peace to Saul and to the people. David being driven away was a judgment further on Saul, so that he knew he was under God's displeasure. See, this is how God often works. When God brings judgment to people or on someone or on nations, he starts to withdraw the access and the knowledge and the sense that he is present or even with them. And he removes the constraints that he's put. He removes the signs of his love. It's what we've sadly seen in our own land, isn't it? Isn't it a case over a number of years now that we've seen the church, the visible sign of the existence of the blessing and of the peace and of the glory of God in our land? Hasn't the church become smaller? Become weaker? And as the cry in our land goes up against God, as hearts are hardened towards him, a sign of God's judgment is the withdrawing of the signs of God's grace. And as that happens, what do we end up seeing? Exactly what we've seen. A push for laws and other things that are opposed to God. The pursuit And that's starting, isn't it? Of those who stand for the Lord, a calling of things that are good, evil, and of things that are evil, good. That's what Saul is doing here in this passage. Hunting down, seeking to remove something that is of good blessing to not only himself, but to the people. You have to remember, though, that doesn't mean that every time that the church or every time as Christians get criticised, that it's a spiritual attack. Sometimes the church has rightly been criticised because of its hypocrisy or issues that haven't been dealt with. But this is often how God works. When judgment starts coming, they hate every sign of God's love, and they want to drive it away, just as Saul sought to drive David away from him. And then thirdly, what we see is God's shelter. God's shelter. After running away from Saul, what David is going to need a place to go, isn't he? And we're told right down there in verse 18 that when David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah. David doesn't go running back home. He doesn't just go run and hide. Instead, when David is faced with this immediate challenge, the king's threatening his own life, what does he do? Runs to Samuel. Why Samuel? Well, Samuel anointed him as king, but Samuel is still the high priest. He's still the prophet. He is still the one who is able to bring worship to God. He is still, in some senses, God's mouthpiece to the land. He's the one who's going to be able to teach God's word. He is the one that communicates from God to the people still. Samuel's role hadn't changed. He was still there. He just wasn't given, he was more sheltered, and he took himself and kept himself away from Saul. And so this makes perfect sense for David when facing trouble to run to Samuel. Why? Because just like us, when trouble crops up, what do we want? A sense of the nearness of God. A sense of being able to draw near to God. A sense of wanting to be with God in his place. He wants a place of safety and shelter. And that's what he's gone to find. He's sheltering in God. And you go, well, that sounds brilliant, doesn't it? Sheltering in God. Let's put it as an inspirational Instagram post. Shelter in God. What does that look like? What does it mean? Because we don't have a physical Samuel that we go running to, do we? Every time things go wrong. We don't have a temple or a tabernacle to go and find. Isn't a place where we can go and we can say, well, no matter what happens, doesn't matter. The power of God is going to reach out and stop and prevent the forces from coming to me. But this is what it means, I think, if we're going to shelter in God. It means to trust God at all times, being convinced of his working, knowing his power, and looking to him. Being convinced of his working, knowing his power, looking to him. And that's actually exactly, I think, what we see David expressing. That is part of the reason why he goes seeking Samuel. Because if you turn just with me to Psalm 59. Psalm 59 is the psalm that David wrote when he's running away from Saul, when his house was put under ambush. Right, the very events of this chapter. Psalm 59. We have here David writing down for us what he's feeling and thinking as he's running away. What do we find? Well, first of all, there in verse 5, this is how he views God. You, Lord Almighty, you who are the God of Israel, rouse yourself to punish all the nations. David says, I believe you are the all-powerful God. You are my God, You are the God that I have a relationship with and that I know. You are the God of Israel, he says. You are mine. And he goes down into, if we go down and look at verse 16, David says, I will sing of your strength in the morning. I will sing of your love, for you are my fortress, my refuge in times of trouble. David says, look, first of all, I'm going to recognize that you are powerful. You are my God. You are the Almighty. You are the God of my people. You are mine. But then he says, as is pointed out in verse 16, he says, I'm going to sing of your strength. I'm convinced that you are able to strengthen me, to sustain me, to deal with me in this time, and I will sing of your love in the morning. Everything about me is based on your love. I might have people chasing after me. They might be acting like dogs. They might be trying to consume me, as he talks about throughout this psalm. He says, this is throughout all of this. This is what it means to shelter in you. I'm convinced of who you are. I'm convinced that you can help me through this. And I'm convinced still of your love. He says, I'm not going to shift my attitude. I'm not going to shift my thinking. I'm going to stay remaining, trusting in you. When a child wants to feel safe, what do? Well, they tend to climb further, don't they? Particularly if they're a young child. They draw close to their parents. They want to come closer to the one that they love. They want to feel that their arms wrapped around them. And why do they do that? Well, because they have past experience that the person who's caring for them can care for them. They have a trust that is active, that they can be cared for. And there's a relationship that's active and going on there. And that describes what is taking place here with David. It should describe the way that we approach things with God. When everything goes wrong, what do? Well, actually, what we do is we look backwards. In our car, we've got rear view mirrors. They're intended, aren't they, that when you go around a cyclist, you look in the rear view mirror, you check that you've safely gone round them, not knocked them off and left them in the ditch. Right? But then you know you've got round the obstacle. And as God's people, what are we supposed to keep doing? We're supposed to keep looking backwards. That's what David is doing here in Psalm 59. He's looking backwards. He's saying, look, I've known what you've been in the past. I know what you've done. I know your love. I know that you are my God. These are all the things that I'm assured of. Now, I'll look forwards. I'm going to keep trusting in you. Verse 17, you are my strength. I sing praise to you. You are my God, my fortress, my God on whom I can rely. David had earlier on in the psalm been looking backwards. Now, at the end of the psalm, David says, I'm looking forwards. You are who I will rely upon. In fact, Paul does something very, very similar and talks about this in Romans chapter 5. Just turn with me very briefly as we draw to a close into Romans chapter 5. Having talked about, in Romans chapter 5, having talked about the peace that we now have with God, Paul says in Romans chapter 5, verse 3, not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who he has given to us. Paul says, here's the reason why we carry on. Here's the reason why we persevere, why we continue to have hope through all of our sufferings. Because we know that we've experienced the love of God in the past. That's what it means, isn't it, to shelter in God. To look back at his love, remember that he is working, be convinced of his power and his strength, and then we carry on. That's exactly what David does in this passage, isn't it? David doesn't say at the end of the passage, this is looking a bit too risky. I'll back out of being king. If this is what it's going to cost me over the X number amount of time, I'm not sure I want to face it. But he doesn't. Why? Because he was convinced of the God that he was under. He knew his king. He knew his love, and that would sustain him. When we go through challenges, when we see others amongst our fellowship going through challenges, what is it that sustains? Well, it should be finding it and sheltering in the love of God. We look backwards and say, as God has been, so he will always be. As he's shown love to me and called me to be his own, I can trust him to bring me safely through, and that he will provide for me rightly and according to my needs along the way. There are going to be moments where things go wrong, but we have to remember God is in control, and he's more than able to meet and provide for our needs. He's always acting for his glory, including bringing judgment, which sometimes we might, as God's people, feel the impact or the effect of. But we can always find shelter in God and remain convinced of his love and of his power.